Hello and welcome to Innovation Unlocked by Mathys Squire, an intellectual property powerhouse, bringing you the top insights into inspiring inventions and booming businesses and how to protect them. I'm your host, Andrew White, and today I'm joined by my colleagues, Sean Leach, Posy Drywood, and David Hobson. And we're going to be discussing IP strategy and how you develop and implement IP strategies for different sized businesses. Sean, do you mind telling us a little bit about your background and practice area?
Sure, thanks. So originally I'm a physicist and that's where my practice started. I spent the early years of my career probably in telecoms and software and then evolved from that into electronics and medical devices and physics instrumentation, which is most of my practice now.
Brilliant, thanks. And Posy?
So I'm originally a chemist by background and I'm now a partner in the chemistry team at Mathys Squire. I've spent my whole career at Mathys Squire and have been working here now for 16 years. My practice space is a mixture of pharmaceutical clients and then industrial chemistry as well.
Great, thanks. And David?
So I'm a biochemist by background. I got a PhD in biochemistry. I've been at Mathys now for just over 10 years. I'm one of the life sciences partners, specialise in biotech and pharma. So cell therapies, antibodies, and the like.
Brilliant, thanks. So I think we thought this podcast would be great to explore that, obviously everyone's got different backgrounds here in different practice areas. And I'm aware that we all work with different size clients. So, some of us do a lot of startup client works, SME, some of us do bigger, larger corporate work. So I thought it'd be really interesting to sort of have a discussion around that and about how IP strategy maybe is different or similar for the different practice areas and different sized businesses, and thought we could have just a general conversation around that. So just to sort of put it out there, and each of you might have different experiences yourselves, but just putting it to Sean maybe first, how do you go about if you're going to start working with a client, and it could be different size clients. So maybe if we start with a smaller client first, if a smaller client approaches you and says, we need some help. Maybe they see something very specific, like we want to file a patent application for this thing. How do you start working with them? How do you do that initial sort of developing an IP strategy? And is it as simple as, yes, you just file that patent application, or is it actually you sort of back up a bit and say, hold on, what's the commercial picture here and so on. So
I think it probably depends quite a lot on the client particularly and what their experience of the IP system is. If you're dealing with somebody who's completely new to managing IP and what they want to do with it, then definitely you need to take that sort of broader view, understand commercially what they're doing in their business, why they want the patent, what they're trying to achieve with it, and then put it in the broader context of their business and go from there. If there's someone who's been around the block and knows what they want to achieve, then, honestly, that's much more straightforward. You can learn much more about them much more quickly because they know the kind of things that you need to know.
Brilliant. Okay. Posy, you're nodding. So.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Sean said. And I think one of the things that I think we all find, I've worked with Andy and Sean a lot on stuff, is that especially smaller, less experienced clients tend to see their IP strategy a bit more narrowly than we see it. So they might come and say, I want to file a patent for this reason. And actually one area that's really important to get to the bottom of is all of their unregistered IP and their know-how and other aspects of their business that might be affected by IP, whether that's, entering into collaboration agreements or ownership issues. And I think that's where having a really strong relationship and understanding a client's business is so important for small companies, so you can advise them on bits of their IP strategy that it's not things that they've done wrong, they just don't really realise that it's things that they need to be considering in their IP strategy. But then that's super different with bigger clients because they're so much savvier about that stuff and have systems in place to make sure that they're keeping information secret, recording it.
But that's a really good point. I think how well you know them, particularly with smaller clients, is really, really significant because, there have been times where I've been in the lab or at the bench with somebody looking at something they're developing and looked at something that looks a bit unusual in a piece of technology and go, oh, why is that shape? Why is the layout of the circuit board like that? And then the conversation which comes from that leads to something of real value, which if you didn't have that relationship with them, you would never have identified.
Yeah.
Right?
And actually that relationship is key. And I think that's one of the things that as a firm we do quite well is, we spend the time to invest in our clients and get to know their technology. And actually sometimes it can just be as simple as just having an overview, because you're not sort of, when you're the person there, you're the inventor, you're sort of specifically working on something. It can be helpful for somebody to come in and have an overview and say, actually, have you thought about this? And actually, sometimes it's just the perspective that's helpful. But we work closely, don't we? I mean, we all do with our clients in terms of trying to have a bespoke strategy for clients. It's going to shift with the clients depending on what stage they're at and what they want to do.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. Is I think a lot of the time when very early stage clients come to us, they'll say, would you want a patent for, we need to raise investment, we're getting seed round or Series A, we need some IP on file for the investors. But then, we have long-term relationships with our clients. And so, 5 years time, that strategy is completely evolved. And actually it's about really protecting the market share because there's two competitors that, that are in the space and they're, on their back. So how do you manage that sort of evolving of the strategy over time? And, is there things that you need to think about, take into account? Who wants to go? Posy?
Yeah, I think, again, keeping a close relationship with your clients is what really helps, sort of checking in with them regularly to have more general discussions about their strategy rather than just, okay, we have an office action response coming up that we need to address. Because then you can sort of talk around issues like, you mentioned competitors and maintaining your market share. When you're really small, you don't really need to worry so much about people coming along and reverse engineering what you do because nobody knows about you. And as you start to grow, then people start paying you attention and it becomes much more like a realistic possibility that somebody might come and start trying to sort of file around what you're doing, looking at what you're doing, thinking how they can incorporate your technology into their business. And you only really can understand how a client's evolving by visiting them face to face is so good. And sort of learning about what they're hoping to achieve in the next year or two and thinking what we can do to help them on that journey.
It's a moving target, isn't it? Because, competitors change, direction of businesses change. There's always over time things will change to become the new sort of key focus. One area that we see in the pharma side of things is, we've got clients who are going into clinical trials with particular biologics, for example, and the filing strategy has to be tailored for that. It might have started off as the fact that you've got several different candidates, but one becomes principal and key. We can look back at the portfolio and see, how much early protection can we get around different aspects for that molecule that's going to give us sort of future coverage. These are things that we sit with our clients and work through. But going back to the questions around the filing strategies and things, there's a very different strategy for a molecule that's in clinical trials, for example, because there's all the evergreening that goes on as well. You might be looking at methods of manufacture, which initially you probably don't want to put in a patent application. You don't want them to be out there because you don't want to give your competitors an advantage. But as it's getting towards the end of exclusivity around, say, a composition of matter patent, it's good to have things like that out there because it's going to cause a headache for any biosimilars that are going to come to market, same with formulations, etc. So I think it really is a sort of horses for courses.
And I think there are related issues. There are related issues in kind of engineering medtech. So medical device strategy isn't. Obviously the considerations are different because we don't have the same requirement for clinical trials in quite the same way. But the route from conception of an idea through to realization and regulatory approval is a long timeline, and technology changes along the way. And there's a temptation at the outset when you're writing a patent application frankly, to throw the kitchen sink into
Yeah,
it and
exactly.
put every tiny detail in. But that's a terrible idea
Yeah.
because then your publication timeline will be your own worst enemy, right?
Yeah.
And so you've got to think ahead, understand enough about the prior art to know what you need to disclose to get you the protection you need, but then have an eye for the quotes evergreening that you're talking about, looking ahead. All right, when we come to implement this idea in practice, what's going to be commercially necessary, what's practically necessary, either to meet the regulatory requirement, to meet the customer need, to give clinicians what they want, and to understand that engineering as you go, and to have patents which back it up. But kind of more broadly, other engineering sectors, to some extent, the same is true because technology changes, everything changes from the moment someone comes up with an idea through to getting something into a customer's hand. The amount of engineering that goes on along the way, the number of times I've been working with a client 4 or 5 years after a patent application's been filed, and in their minds they have a very clear idea of what's in this application. Whether that necessarily is what's in the application or not is a completely different question. And so I think, just to go back to something you said earlier, those regular conversations as you go along, keeping up to date with the technology as it evolves, I don't think there's any substitute for
No,
that.
absolutely. It is, and that's the key, isn't it? It's being engaged and sort of living our client story with them,
Yeah.
and having sort of the passion for their success. Which
Yeah.
I
It's
think
also
that's
just-
something that we do well.
It's also just really nice for us to be able to see them because we have all of these.
Yeah.
We're fundamentally paper pushers, and
Yes.
we have all of these amazing clients that are doing amazing
Amazing
exciting
work.
things.
Yeah.
And it's so nice visiting them and being like,
Yeah.
wow, that is
Yeah. You've
really
got-
cool, and you're doing something that actually makes a difference, and we
Yeah.
can be, not even a part of it, but we can sort of live vicariously through the
absolutely.
lovely things
Yeah.
that you're doing, and that's nice.
Exactly.
Yeah, because we're all really in this job essentially because we're technology geeks, right?
Yeah.
And you put
Yeah.
interesting technology in front of us, like, oh wow, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it sort of brings it back to the real world, doesn't it? Because it can be an academic exercise, or it could become an academic exercise if you don't have that sort of real world grounding. So
Yeah.
I certainly enjoy that.
Yeah, and brings it back to the business world because
Exactly.
that's something that you can also be a bit removed from when it comes to sort of daily prosecution work. But actually, especially for smaller clients, there's things like the investment environment and money and fundraising and how to actually run a successful business and how IP forms a part of that is huge. So I also always learn a lot from clients that I visit about that side of things that then can be useful when talking to other clients.
But I think that's why some of the stuff you mentioned earlier about understanding their unregistered IP position is really important, because you've got to be able to take the whole picture into account, right? What agreements have they got? What copyright and confidential information do they hold? How does the whole picture fit together?
So I'd like to come back to that in a sec, but just before that, there were a few points we touched on in terms of a patent filing needing to sort of achieve multiple purposes and that evolving over time, and then that careful balance between how much do you disclose in the patent application versus how much do you hold back, and then sometimes if you're working for a very early stage company, is it actually that they've got a bundle of ideas and they're not sure which are commercially viable? So, and then you might want to put all of those in the patent application and file potential divisionals later versus holding some stuff back. So how do you, in your experience, sort of manage that? But, the temptation to put everything in there versus then the challenge of actually you've put too much in there, they haven't developed the idea enough, and then you kind of can shoot yourself in the foot later on.
So this is a favourite topic of mine, actually.
Excellent.
I think there needs to be less of a division between the strategy that small companies use and that which large companies use. The big guys are getting this right, okay? In my view, you want very narrowly focused, short patent applications which deal with one idea and its refinements and nothing else. That's good for a whole load of reasons. Cost control is easier. Translation costs are lower. When it comes to interpretation of claims, they're harder for the other guys to shoot down. So at a really high level, what you want, in my view, is short, single idea patent applications. I won't go so far as to call them one-trick ponies, but something like that. And a low threshold for filing them. Mm-hmm. Is it novel? Is it of commercial value? If so, we have a crack at it and see if we can get over the inventive step hurdle. So you have a low threshold for filing and a high threshold for keeping, right? So before you get to the publication deadline, you've looked at this thing, you said, are we going to get enforceable legal rights out of this? If yes, keep it. If no, or we don't care about the scope anymore, you bin it before it publishes. And then you can easily control what's being disclosed by a portfolio. You know where everything is. You know where all the bodies are buried, basically. So when someone comes to you with a new invention, you don't walk into your own prior art. And okay, at the outset, when you're writing a portfolio and you've got a handful of cases, that's easy. When that's turned into 15, 20, 40, 100 families, that problem suddenly becomes much more difficult. So,
I mean, the thing is, how do you marry that up with balancing costs, especially for early stage clients when they can't afford to file that many patent applications, and of course the sort of the downstream costs. So if you're looking at international patent applications, then national, regional phases, the costs can quickly add up. Also, for very early stage, whether it's, I wouldn't say businesses, but ideas, whether it's a startup or a larger entity, they might not know the commercial viability of that idea. And so they might not want to file 10 patent applications on it because they're like, we don't know if this is worth it. So how do you sort of manage that? Or,
I mean, it's a difficult problem.
Yeah.
I think predictability in costs is really important. So being able to say to somebody, right, you're starting a patent family now. This is what the cost timeline looks like. There are no surprises here. We all know what the next roughly 2.5 years are going to look like, 3 years are going to look like, and we can give you predictability on those costs. And just making clear that the client knows this is the money they're spending, and this is when the different costs are going to turn up. Then if in that picture you're saying, all right, we can't afford to file a bundle of cases here, and we can live with the downside of having joint disclosures that we can't control individually, then okay, you defer some cost and say, well, we're going to have to file divisionals in 3 or 4 years' time. Yeah.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because especially for small clients, they've got a product, or there's something that they see that they're building their business on, and in some respects, that patent application is more important than sort of an evergreening type application that you might be filing for a bigger company. So there's more riding on that patent application, and the balance of costs is quite an interesting one because, as we all know, if a patent application's been drafted cheaply, there can be potential issues with that, difficulty getting things through prosecution and through to grant. And I mean, my sort of approach and my suggestion to people is to not skimp on the drafting, because that's paramount, because getting a good draft that has to last for 20 years, especially in sort of bio and pharma, it has to be around, because you're probably not going to get through clinical trials in that time. It has to be there, and it has to do that job. And costs are saved later. So actually, sort of putting the money behind a good draft, I think, is incredibly important.
I think we've all seen it. Saving on the drafting costs nearly 9 times out of 10 is a false economy. The number of times then prosecution costs have doubled, tripled because you're arguing over points that were poorly drafted. Yeah, definitely.
And actually, also when it comes to opposition as well, at the point a patent's been granted, it's incredibly valuable, and companies spend a lot of money defending during EPO opposition procedures. And if you've got a good draft in the first place, it's a lot easier to defend that patent.
So I had an interesting experience recently. Investment company, an investment funder, was having DD done on a client's portfolio, and I just got to the end of a series of really quite difficult oppositions against a major German firm, and having been in a series of hearings with 2 attorneys from this major German firm on the other side, who turned up to do the DD on all of my drafting work, but these 2 individuals, they're both really, really excellent, really tough opponents. But having been going at it hammer and tongs with them for however long, having them then mark my homework was quite interesting and actually very gratifying when I got full marks.
That's good. Yeah, well, they wouldn't have held back in kicking the tires, would they?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was a moment when the first video call started and it came up as,
Oh, hello. Yeah.
I think there's another complication, certainly in the chemical field, and I think, David, with you as well, and that's the need really to have some sort of data, which complicates the filing strategy because, around the world, but particularly with a focus in Europe, you do get squeezed on your scope depending on the level of data that you have. So there's a constant dialogue with clients when you're drafting an application as to when to actually push the button, when you have enough data to sort of reasonably substantiate the claims that you're trying to make, but also, perhaps if they expect to be getting more data, do we try and time the first filing, the priority filing, such that we can incorporate that data in the first year? So that can complicate the idea of sort of filing simple, quick applications.
Yeah, it's a whole different sort of ball game, I think, than you guys in terms of our inventive step and the sufficiency requirements. And if anything, it's just got worse.
I think
the scope of claim, etc.
I think we might start to see some of that in the ML AI field,
right?
Because there are areas of inventions where technical effect will be probabilistic. Basically, you're going to have to be arguing that when the training data is set up in this particular way, or the ML model is configured in this particular way, on a probabilistic basis, the results solve this technical problem in a majority of cases. And there have been decisions from the Board of Appeal in the last few years which have said, well, this technical effect, you haven't shown that this technical effect is credibly achieved,
right?
Because there's no data. So in some areas in ML, we might end up needing comparative examples to show the effect achieved within the claim and not outside it.
It's bizarre, isn't it, really, that we're all working under the EPC, etc., but we've all got very different requirements.
Definitely.
But knowing and being aware of those and being able to sort of properly incorporate it into the filing strategies is critical. But I think the difficulty also comes in for smaller clients as well, where VCs, etc., other investors, they want to see a patent application. And it's like you've got this tug in pharma, bio, and chemistry in terms of, you need the data to be able to file the patent application. You need the money to get the data.
Pay for the data, yeah.
And it's it's a vicious circle, actually.
Just talking about funding and burning costs and filing too many patent applications. I mean, Posy, do you have experience of working with clients where they've had issues with spending too much?
Yeah, completely. And I think this goes back to the point that Sean made, that it's so important in our role to be transparent about the long-term costs associated with a patent filing. And the question that people always ask is, how much will it cost to draft and file this patent? And it's not, it's not a small amount to draft and file a patent, but it is a relatively small amount in the context of, a 20-year multi-territory patent family. So I think being upfront about those costs is essential, really, for small businesses. And we have clients. I work with a client who, when they came to us, they had filed fairly prolifically on their IP, and they did it before they had the money to support that portfolio. And so you end up in a scenario where they'd had to drop their entire patent portfolio, apart from their sort of first key core patent, and they'd put all of this subsequent information in the public domain, and weren't able to maintain the monopolies that could have been conferred by those rights. So they end up sort of really building their portfolio again from scratch when they did have money. And they managed to do that. So it's also very important not to spend too much time crying over spilt milk if you do end up in a scenario where you have to drop stuff and can't pay for it. But I think that nearly always arises because of people not understanding the longer term costs associated with patenting.
I think pragmatism is important when it comes to this, and trying to sort of work out, is this something that's really going to be of a benefit to the business? It's interesting actually when you look at the US and SMEs in the US, and they file quite prolifically.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a sort of in for a penny, in for a pound.
I mean, I think my
sort of point as well. If you've got a ready-made portfolio ready to go, it's quite attractive to investors. It's quite attractive to collaborators as well in the pharma space if they see that a company's been very diligent in terms of protecting its rights. It's a much easier package to sell. If somebody wants to exit.
So
I
think the point you touch on about the differing attitudes to IP and investment in the US and the UK in particular, there's a whole podcast in that specifically.
I'm
right?
sure.
There's a really interesting conversation
Maybe that's one
there.
for a future episode.
Yeah.
But I mean, just in summary, I think all of our collective experiences is that in the US they're just way more pro patenting
Yes, I
than
think
in
so,
the UK
yeah.
at least.
I'd say more pro legal services.
Yeah.
as a whole.
Yeah.
But also aggressive in business terms, right?
Yeah.
They've got an objective. This is what we're going to achieve. How do we get there? How do we place our tokens to get there? And
they're not afraid to pay for it to
Yeah.
achieve that.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is the world in which we live, and
Yeah.
there's got to be a benefit there for UK clients as well, and EU clients adopting a similar sort of strategy and approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sean, earlier on, you talking about sort of being at the bench top and talking to the inventors and sort of thinking about creating an IP strategy at that stage. Are there different ways of creating IP strategies in terms of focusing on a product or focusing on the business as a whole or revenue streams or sort of and how might that work, and is one better than the other?
There are lots of different ways. What works for one business won't work for another, and you need to choose the way you approach things. I mean, it sounds obvious, but depending on the circumstances. And the only way I think to do that is to be able to impose a structure of some type. So take the product in question. What are its components? What are the different systems within it? For example, just in really general terms in engineering, you've probably got some electronics, you've probably got some mechanical components, and you've probably got some software and services that go along with it. And in each of those three different threads, how are you going to deal with the IP in each one? And building a strategy around that basic structure, so kind of be technology-led. And it'll be different in different fields of technology, but that I think is always going to be the starting point.
I think you can also kind of map your strategy. If you get a business to draw a picture of how their business works on a piece of paper, then if they draw it on a product basis, then that's probably a really good way to think about how you might structure an IP strategy. If they draw it based on a territories basis or different operations in different countries, then that might be your starting point, because the IP strategy should always really reflect the business strategy, and how we talk about things with our clients will depend on how they talk about things to us, and us kind of mirroring back to them.
Yeah, and I think maybe the most important part of that conversation is how are you going to make money from this thing?
Yeah, totally.
Start from there.
Yeah.
The
What's
commercial
making you
interest
money
has
about your technology, and let's focus there.
Has to be principled, doesn't it? Always. Otherwise, what's the point of the patents?
Brilliant. Well, that's been a really interesting chat, guys. Any final thoughts on IP strategy?
Talk to your patent attorney as much as you can.
Don't skimp on drafting the first patent application well.
Yeah.
Educate us about your technology. Show us what you're doing.
Yeah. I think, the fundamental to it all is the patent attorney's got to understand what's going on in the business and how things are working. Brilliant. Well, thanks, David, Posy,
Thank you.
Sean.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really interesting.